Hi class, and welcome to chapter 5, which will be an overview of cellular metabolism, which is the way that your body takes in food, breaks it down into glucose, and turns it into ATP or energy. We'll be going over glycolysis, which is the first step in that, and the lactic acid pathway and how those two relate. I did upload a video in the module right under the chapter 5 PowerPoint of a video by McGraw-Hill, the publisher of your textbook, and it's a great video outlining these steps of cellular metabolism respiration. So I would encourage you guys to take a look at that because it's sometimes easier to see a video of it than you just hear me talk and look blankly at a screen. So what is metabolism? And cellular metabolism, cellular respiration, I'll use those two terms interchangeably because in this instance they mean the same thing, and you'll see why. First of all of the reactions in your body that require energy transfer can be divided into anabolism, which requires the input of energy to synthesize large molecules, and catabolism, which breaks large molecules into smaller ones. They drive each other, and basically your catabolic reactions that break down glucose, fatty acids, and amino acids, which build proteins, serve as energy sources for the anabolism of ATP. They involve many reduction reactions, which we talked about in chapter 4, and the complete catabolism of glucose requires oxygen as the final electron acceptor. So this is why you breathe in oxygen, because all of your cells need it to break down glucose to create energy, ATP, that all of your cells need. Without oxygen, your cells die and you die. So we call this aerobic cellular respiration in the presence of oxygen. Breaking down glucose requires many enzymes, and the first are actually anaerobic, which means they do not require oxygen. So the aerobic respiration of glucose occurs in 3 steps. Glycolysis occurs in the cytoplasm of the cell. This is an anaerobic step, no oxygen is needed. And then your citric acid cycle and the electron transport chain occur in the mitochondria. And this is an aerobic reaction, meaning it does require oxygen. Here's the chemical formula of cellular respiration. This first molecule is glucose with 6 carbons. Add that to oxygen and you'll get 6 carbon dioxides released, 6 waters, and ATP. The water and the carbon dioxide are what you breathe out as vapor, as what you exhale, carbon dioxide and the vapor. So that's just a waste product of cellular respiration. And obviously ATP is what we want to get out at the end because that's the end goal of cellular respiration and metabolism. So glucose comes in from your digestive tract when you eat food, and that glucose goes into your blood plasma into your cells. And inside your cells, glycolysis occurs, which breaks down that glucose into pyruvic acid. Pyruvic acid then will enter the citric acid cycle in the mitochondria and the electron transport chain, and will kick out ATP, carbon dioxide, and water at the end. So this is aerobic respiration. In the absence of oxygen, this pyruvic acid stays in the cytoplasm of the cells and goes through anaerobic metabolism, where it turns into lactic acid. And this builds up in your skeletal muscles. And this is what you guys can feel if you ever worked out before or lifted weights and you feel a burn in your muscles. You're feeling the lactic acid buildup of anaerobic metabolism. So glycolysis is the first step. This literally means the splitting of sugar. That's what lysis means, splitting of sugar into 2 pyruvic acid molecules. It also produces these 2 NADHs, which are important in holding electrons between its bonds, which will be important for the electron transport chain. The net energy gain in glycolysis is only 2 ATP, so it's not that much. 4 ATP are actually generated, but 2 ATP are required in the first step of glycolysis. So net gain in glycolysis is only 2 ATP. And again, this happens in the cytoplasm of cells. So this is a look at use and expenditure of energy in glycolysis. 2 ATP are required in the first 2 steps of glycolysis, taking this glucose molecule And then it creates 2 NADHs and 2 ATP at the end, and then another 2 ATP. So if you look at this in general, we need 2 ATP at the beginning, and we get 4 ATP at the end, and 2 pyruvic acids. But since we started with 2 ATP, the net gain is only 2 ATP. And that is shown here. So here's the glycolysis pathway. That's kind of a lot to take in, but what it's showing you is just how glucose is being broken down into 2 pyruvic acids. That's all I want you to really remember about glycolysis, is that it breaks glucose into 2 pyruvic acids. It creates 2 NADHs, and it also net gain produces 2 ATP. The lactic acid pathway occurs when there's no oxygen to complete the breakdown of glucose, so NADH has to give its electrons to pyruvic acid. This basically results in the formation of lactic acid, and that's what can build up in your muscles. It's also called the anaerobic metabolism pathway, or lactic acid formation. It still yields a net gain of ATP. Muscle cells can survive for a while without oxygen by using lactic acid fermentation. Aerobic respiration then. The equation for aerobic respiration that you should know is this. It's in bold. This is 1 glucose molecule combined with oxygen. It'll yield 6 carbon dioxides and 6 waters as waste. It'll also produce ATP. It begins with glycolysis, which is the first step. It's enzymatically controlled, not in large amounts of heat. So it will produce 2 pyruvic acids, 2 NADH, and 2 ATP. That pyruvic acid will continue on in the metabolic pathway called the citric acid cycle, and the NADHs will be oxidized later to make ATP. The fate of pyruvic acid, basically the 1 glucose molecule is creating 2 pyruvic acids, which will eventually turn into 2 acetyl-CoAs. And acetyl-CoA is what we need, which is shown here for the citric acid cycle. The citric acid cycle, also called TCA, is where acetyl-CoA combines with oxaloacetic acid to form citric acid. And citric acid is what will start the citric acid cycle. And this is just a cycle because citric acid will move throughout it through a series of reactions to become oxaloacetic acid again. So we have a beginning product of oxaloacetic acid and an end product of the same molecule. So it'll start and end with the same structure. So that's why we call it a cycle. Some important events in here, you have 3 molecules of NAD are reduced to form NADH, and NADH is important because it holds extra electrons in its bonds, and 1 molecule of FAD is reduced to form FADH2. And again, this is important because it holds electrons. And again, these events will occur for each acetic acid, so this cycle will actually go through twice for each glucose molecule that heads through it. Here's a simplified diagram of the citric acid cycle, taking in the 2 pyruvic acids, changing them into acetyl-CoAs, and then entering the cycle 2 times. And then here are the end products of each time through this cycle. Here's the complete citric acid cycle, which will probably make you go crazy. I like the simplified diagram of it because it really takes you through the basic understanding of what this cycle is about. So for each glucose molecule, these are your products. And you should kind of know that these are the products for each glucose molecule. And then in the electron transport chain, this happens in the mitochondria. And I'm going to kind of go through this, and you basically, I want to look at a picture here. Let me see if there's a picture, kind of. So this is, we call oxidative phosphorylation. Basically, these electrons that are coming from the NADH and FADH2, those extra electrons, they're pumping the protons, the H pluses, through different pumps throughout the intermembrane of the mitochondria. When we pump these hydrogen ions over to the intermembrane space, we're creating a concentration of hydrogen ions that's greater up here. These hydrogen ions are able to be pumped through the membrane because of energy from electrons, which are being transferred between proteins in the membrane. And when we get a higher concentration of hydrogens in this intermembrane space, they will rush through this ATP synthase at the end. And the ATP synthase will require that rush of hydrogen ions to turn ADP in a phosphate into ATP. And those extra hydrogen ions will then combine with oxygen to form water, which will then be a waste product of the cells. So this is oxidative phosphorylation. Again, that video that I posted under the Chapter 5 PowerPoint in Module 1 is a great video of what this is. The function of oxygen, it acts as the final electron acceptor, and without a final acceptor, the whole process would come to a halt. So this is why we breathe in oxygen and why we need oxygen. Water is also formed in the reaction. ATP balance sheet, basically at the end of the day, you guys should know that theoretical ATP yield is about 36 to 38 ATPs per glucose molecule. And you can read through kind of these other more detailed accounting of how much ATP we get at the end of one glucose molecule. A little bit more about glucose, lactic acid, and glycogen. Glycogenesis, cells can't store much glucose. So glucose is stored in larger molecules called glycogen. So really simply put, glucose is stored as glycogen in your liver, skeletal muscles, and cardiac muscles. And glycogen is formed from glucose via a process called glycogenesis. And this takes you through the process of glycogenesis, but basically it's just turning glucose into glycogen, which is a storage form that will remain in your liver. Well, your liver is the big reservoir of glycogen, but you also might find some in your skeletal muscles. So here's glycogenesis in the liver. Again, it's storing glucose in the liver as glycogen. The Cori cycle, some lactic acid can be used in cellular produce carbon dioxide and water. If skeletal muscles make too much of it, it's also shipped to the liver, and the liver just converts lactic acid to pyruvic acid and NADH, which could go back into the cellular metabolism cycle. So this is a little bit of the Cori cycle shown there. Common metabolic process terms. There's a lot of G words, a lot of L words. So knowing the term and the process, this is a great chart for helping you kind of read through those. The metabolism of lipids and proteins. Lipids and proteins also serve as a source for energy, and they serve as a source for energy via the same pathways used by the metabolism of pyruvic acid. So when more food energy is taken into the body than is needed, we can't store ATP for later. So instead, glucose is converted to glycogen and fat. So this makes sense. If you eat too much, you get fat because your glucose, the extra food that you're eating, is being stored as fat. ATP production will be inhibited if there's too much of it. So this is the conversion of glucose into glycogen and fat. Lipid metabolism, as ATP levels rise after an energy-rich meal, production of ATP is also inhibited because glucose doesn't complete glycolysis to form pyruvic acid. So fatty acids will combine with glycerol to form triglycerides in adipose tissue in the liver, and this is called lipogenesis. So again, this is just showing how too much glucose and too much food is actually a bad thing, because it can inhibit this cycle and you'll store the extra glucose in your liver, in your tissues as fat. And we all know that that's a bad thing. Extra fat in your liver can harm your liver, and extra fat in your body can have many harmful effects in your body. So this is just showing how acetyl-CoA gets transferred to lipids. Lipid metabolism is just a way where lipids could be broken down into energy. So fatty acids can be an energy source, Beta oxidation of fat is just the chemical reaction of turning fat into energy. Lipid metabolism uses brown adipose tissue or brown fat, which is just stored in different cells. Sympathetic release of norepinephrine will cause brown fat to form different proteins, which will leak out of the intermitochondrial membrane. Ketone bodies, I'll let you read through this, and then amino acid metabolism has to do with proteins, which are providing nitrogen for the body. And amino acids from dietary proteins are needed to replace proteins in the body. So this is why you might be required or encouraged to eat different types of proteins in the body to help replace your proteins in your body that are being used to make energy. Here are the essential amino acids and non-essential amino acids. Transamination, pyruvic acid, and several other citric acid intermediates can be converted to amino acids by adding an amine group. Here's transamination. I won't ask you guys too many questions about this. And amino acid metabolism, I'll let you read through. But again, for this chapter, I want you to focus on mainly just cellular metabolism, those 3 steps of glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. And this is just going through the steps of oxidative deamination. And again, it's just important to remember that lipids, fats, and amino acids, which are proteins, can be used as energy because they can enter in this cycle when they turn their amino acids into pyruvic acid. Uses of different energy sources, just in review, glucose and ketone bodies come from the liver, fatty acids come from adipose tissue, and lactic acids and amino acids come from muscle. So this is just showing again how you can have different energy sources. Glycogen, which will be stored as glucose in the liver, triglycerides, which are all your fatty acids, glycerol, and then your proteins, which are amino acids. They can all be energy sources because they can all be changed into pyruvic acid or acetyl-CoA. And once they become pyruvic acid and acetyl-CoA, they can enter the citric acid cycle, which will eventually go on and turn into the electron transport chain, which will create energy or ATP. Here's the relative importance of different energy sources to different organs. And this is just an interesting table because it'll take you through the different organs and the relative importance of different molecules in the blood with respect to their energy requirements. And that's the end of this chapter. So we've gone through 5 chapters now. So we will have our first lecture exam in a couple days if you're keeping up with this. And I hope you guys are all doing well.